Değerli konuklar, sevgili izleyiciler, Fikir Önderleri yayınımıza hepiniz hoş geldiniz efendim. Bu akşam çok önemli bir konu ve çok önemli bir konuyu ağırlıyor olacağız. Ama konuğumuzla sohbete geçmeden önce malum artık herkesin alıştığı ama benim her programda tekrar etmek durumunda olduğum birkaç detayı, teknik hatırlatmayı sizlerle paylaşmayı arzu ediyorum sevgili dostlar. Biliyorsunuz yayınlarımız Instagram, YouTube ve Twitter'da aynı anda gerçekleşiyor. Bizi bu mecralardan herhangi birinden takip edebilirsiniz. Fakat eğer bize soru sormak istiyorsanız, özellikle değerli konuğumuza tabii ki, bizi YouTube kanalından takip etmenizi rica edeceğim. Oradaki kenardaki sohbet bölümünü kullanarak sorularınızı bize iletebilirsiniz. Ben de fırsat buldukça ve sohbetimizde zaman kaldığında sonunda bu soruları kendisine iletmeye gayret edeceğim. Malum bu pandemi dönemi hepimiz için zor bir dönem oldu. Özellikle ilk anlarda ciddi bir stresle, ciddi bir travmayla karşı karşıya kaldık. Ve aslında birçok liderin bugüne kadar alıştığı liderlik becerilerinin yanında bu travmaları da anlamak, hem kurum için hem de bireyler için bunları yönetmek gibi bir yeni görevi, yeni alanı oluştu diyebiliriz. Bugün bu konuda çok değerli çalışmalar yapan hem akademide hem pratikte çok önemli bir kişiyle birlikte olacağız. Bize yazdığı makalede bu dönemleri nasıl atlatması gerektiğini çok güzel bir çerçeveyle anlatmıştı. Dr. Richard Tedeschi bizlerle birlikte olacak. Şimdi ben kendisiyle sohbete başlıyorum. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
First of all, let's start with a broad question or an icebreaker, if I may say. We have been going through this pandemic for a while. It has been now in Turkey officially at least a year, a full year that we have been going through all these lockdowns and ups and downs. So how are you affected? How this pandemic changed your life? What do you feel about this?
Well, it's had some personal effect on my life. It's had on most people. As I'm doing most of my sessions right now by Zoom video with clients that I'm seeing. So this is something that's new to me to work that way with people. So that's certainly a little different. At Boulder Crest, where we work with our programs, we've gone ahead starting last summer with our programming. So at Boulder Crest, we've adapted to as much as possible to do safety measures and continue with our programming. So we've had that. And then, of course, the people I work with have spoken quite a bit about what they're going through. As a psychologist, I hear a lot from them about their family lives and their work lives being affected. Sometimes in very difficult ways. And so I hear many, many stories about what it's like to live through the pandemic from the point of view of many people.
Right, yeah. It's really tough times. We experienced a significant first wave and second wave. Here in Turkey, maybe we are going through the third wave. We are not sure about that. We will be looking at the numbers to see if it's going to around. But lots of people, as you have mentioned in the article, express their feelings like they are feeling very anxious, very stressed, or they call this series of events a tragedy. So in the article, you just mentioned the difference between personal tragedies and collective tragedies. So do you subscribe to that? And what are some differences between personal tragedies and collective tragedies in terms of their impact?
Well, of course, this is collective and personal at the same time, this pandemic. So we have our own individual situations in the midst of this that vary a lot from person to person, while the collective is experiencing it in many ways socially and economically as a whole. So one person I talked to, I thought had a really good way of describing this by saying, we're all in the same storm, but in different boats. So it is collective in that way. We're in the same storm, but depending on the boat you're in, It may be something that's very frightening, or something that's not too difficult, and maybe doesn't affect you all that much. So a lot of individual differences that way.
Right. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting dynamic, if I may say, because as you have mentioned, some people really affected very badly through this process. Some of them show much more resilience, and they just overcame it shorter than many people think they could do. So at the end of the day, I really like the analogy of this storm and boat. Really makes sense. So about trauma, Richard, in Boulder Crest as an institution, Boulder Crest focuses on post-traumatic growth, and also you focus on trauma and growth at the same time. In Turkish, we have a saying, we say there is good in every bad. So, and also, you know, the famous phrase, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Is those arguments true? Is always what doesn't kill us makes us stronger? And why do we ask this question always in times of crisis?
Well, it turns out that when we look at post-traumatic growth, and maybe it'd be a good idea for me to say what that is. Okay.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Maybe I should say something about what that is first. And that is a positive change that occurs because of the struggle with traumatic events. Okay? Positive change that occurs because of a struggle with traumatic events. And let me say one other thing about trauma before we go on to define that, because when we talk about post-traumatic growth in the traumatic events that we struggle with, what we think people are really struggling with is a challenge to their core belief system. That what makes things traumatic is when events occur that are hard to make sense of and understand, or are very surprising, that don't fit with what people assumed was going to happen in their lives, and disrupt their sort of life plan or life story in some way, or what they always thought was true about themselves, about other people, about the world they live in, the future they have, things of that kind. So traumas disrupt this belief system, and the struggle is to reconstruct it and to put it back in place in some way that allows the world to look more sensible and understandable. So that's what we go through. And so some people handle that struggle very well and are able to change in some positive ways, which we can talk about in some detail if you'd like. Change in some positive ways. But some people have a great deal of difficulty reconstructing a core belief system, and maybe a long time, if ever, until they find something of value in this experience. So not everybody experiences post-traumatic growth. So so there's that. And then you mentioned resilience. Some people are resilient to events, and therefore they don't find themselves too affected by them. They're in a good boat, and they don't find themselves too affected by these events. So so for them, there may not be much change. They don't need to change. Their core belief system is intact. And they can say, well, I get this, I understand this, or this doesn't shock me, or this doesn't surprise me, and I can get along with it. I can weather this storm okay. So they don't have to do anything different. So those are some of the concepts that we were working with when we talk about post-traumatic growth.
Great. So you mentioned change in positive ways. Let's dig down a little bit into that. So how can someone emerge stronger or change in positive ways after a tragedy or a post-traumatic event?
Well, we have found that there are generally 5 categories of change, 5 different kinds of changes that people tend to report. And some people report maybe experiencing just one, some people more than one. So one change that I think you're referring to in your question here is a change in the degree to which people sense their own personal strength. And you know that quote from Nietzsche about what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So some people see themselves as maybe having gotten stronger because of what they've had to go through, it strengthened them, or they realize they had the strength to get through it and they didn't realize how strong they were. But there's a change in their perception of their personal capabilities, ability to cope and weather things and to manage the events that are so difficult. So that's one change. Another change we call new possibilities. And I think people who read Harvard Business Review might be particularly interested in this one, because if you're in business or you have a career or work, one of the things that you might notice is events can come along which can derail your plans for your business or your work life and force you into doing something different, perhaps innovative, different than you were doing before, because the circumstances don't allow you to do what you had been doing anymore, and you have to find a different way. So we call these new possibilities in life that open up because in a way change is forced upon you and you have to innovate and find something new to do. Okay, so that's a second area of change. A third area is improved relationships with other people, where you go through these kinds of traumatic events, and it may draw you closer to some people because maybe some people have reached out to help you, or maybe you've had to collaborate with people in order to get through the difficult events. And so you've established different kinds of relationships. Maybe you've become more empathic and understanding of other people because now you've experienced some difficulty and you can appreciate other people who have also experienced similar kinds of difficulties. So the relationships with other people may have improved. A fourth area is appreciation for life. This is where people find that they are aware that they might have taken certain things for granted, not appreciated more deeply what they had until it has gone away. So in perhaps grieving for things that they have lost because of events, they come to appreciate more and have more gratitude for what they do have. And then the fifth area we call spiritual or existential change. And this is where people either change their spiritual or religious belief system or may grapple with existential issues. And existential issues, we mean questions about what life's purpose might be or the meaning of it, you know, what we're here to do, what's the point of it all? So sometimes traumatic events can make people think, you know, what's the point? You know, this is just misery and suffering. You know, why should I even bother going through this? But in continuing to struggle through it, they may find a way to create some meaningful experience out of all of this, to do something with it that is of benefit to either themselves or other people. So that's the fifth area of change that we find people sometimes tell us about.
Right. Richard, as you have gone through these 5 elements of change, it reminds me, each and every of them reminds me of a friend that has gone through it. Some of my friends has left some very conventional industries because they suffered bankruptcies or problems, and they moved to much more innovative and niche industries and became more and more successful and richer and richer by the time. Or some of my friends, they really gone through this existential questioning of life. So why we are here? We need more simplification. So they just move to rural areas and they become they end up doing farming or those kind of more cozy or slow life, if I may say. So it really makes a huge sense. So can someone cope with this by herself or himself, or do they need to get some professional help to go through this, Richard?
Well, let me say that going through this process that can lead to post-traumatic growth is not easy for people. Notice that when I define this, I mentioned the word struggle. So very often this takes a while for people to kind of resolve or to kind of figure out what it is that they're going to do in the aftermath of these events or during events that are ongoing. So there's a struggle to it. And sometimes struggle is better handled with some help. It turns out that if you have people that you can talk to about what you're going through and count on through the process, you're more likely to experience this growth. So there's research about this. All this stuff that I'm talking about, we have research data on that we've looked at for many years. So the process of talking through the dilemmas that people face as they go through this struggle and the choices that they have to make and new understandings they have to come to have happens better when you're having to do this with someone else, because when you talk it through, you have to articulate it. You have to explain yourself to another person. And I'm sure all of your listeners might have had experiences where you try to explain yourself, and by trying to explain yourself, you realize things that you hadn't realized before. The thoughts start to come in a different way when you have to put them into words and get another person to understand what you're talking about in your own experience. So that is often a very helpful way to advance this process. And of course, the other person you're talking to can do something for you by introducing new ideas and perspectives for you to consider. Not necessarily solving your problem for you or even giving you advice necessarily, but just sharing other perspectives or ideas that can move you towards this kind of growth. So that's important. And being with another person is comforting too. If you're in the boat alone, it's a little scarier than when you've got some other people with you. So it's a comfort to be in the situation with some people that really understand, because they may be going through something similar or have in the past.
All right.
So those are important ways that other people can be present for us.
Yeah. Richard, you mentioned 5 elements of change, and also in the article for each and area of these change elements, you introduced a framework that people can use in order to better understand and cope with those changes. And it is like, I'm just reading here: education, emotional regulation, disclosure, narrative development, and service. So let's go through this framework. First of all, as much as I understand, this framework is kind of a playbook that we can use to cope with this change, correct?
Yes. In our research that we did about the process of post-traumatic growth, where we tried to understand what people go through, we uncovered these 5 elements or phases of the process. Mm-hmm. And at Boulder Crest Institute, what we've done is we've taken these 5 phases and we've incorporated them into a intervention program for military service veterans and first responders like emergency medical technicians and police and firefighters, people who are experience trauma in their work. And so we've seen how these 5 phases can help people move towards growth.
Right.
But you mentioned briefly before about professional help, getting professional help. And professional help is not necessarily the case for most people who go through post-traumatic growth. Most of the people we've done our research on have not had professional help, but they've had some kind of personal help very often in moving through these 5 phases. So let me describe each one. And
let's start with the education, the first one.
Yes. Yes. So the education phase is understanding that when you go through trauma, your body and your mind is going to have certain kind of reactions. And these are normal reactions to an abnormal situation. So, for example, the physical reaction that's based on how our brain processes threat has sometimes been called the fight or flight or freeze reaction. That when people are placed in physical danger or animals are placed in physical danger, some animals fight, some run, and some just freeze and stop. So this is a reaction to threat, and this is normal, and this happens to us too. We're going to sometimes experience a physiological change in us that equips us for doing those things. And then we experience that as panic very often, heightened anxiety. And people start to worry that there's something wrong or crazy about them for feeling these things. And we have to educate them and let them know, no, there's nothing wrong with you. This is your alarm reaction to threat. You're perceiving that there's a threat to you, and you just automatically are going to have these kinds of responses physiologically. So there's that. And then the psychological response has to do with this core belief challenge that I mentioned before, that people start to wonder, what to understand about anything. Nothing makes sense, and this is very disturbing and anxiety arousing not to understand your life anymore. That's another reaction that people have to traumatic events. So we have to educate people about that so they understand, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. At Boulder Crest, we say to people, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. Okay.
So one of the things I think throughout this education phase, Richard, is to revisit your assumptions or change your assumptions and perspectives and adapt to a new normal, which we are going through this time. So are there any practical advice or any details how to do that in the research and your experiences?
Yes. So some of the assumptions that people might, it helps to kind of label what the assumptions are. So for example, you might notice that you have assumed that the world is predictable, or that the world is controllable, or the world is benevolent. So notice, try to label what these assumptions are that you've made, because people in everyday life, when everything is just going seemingly according to plan, you don't think about these things. You just don't pay attention to it. You don't have to. It's just everything seems to be going the way you thought. So it's good to kind of take apart what these assumptions are, what these beliefs are, so that you can start to rethink them and reconsider what makes more sense, or what have I learned from this experience? Maybe like, well, the world is not as predictable as I thought. Maybe I do have to be ready for events that take me by surprise. Or maybe the world I'm not in control of my own life in the way I thought. and maybe by allowing myself to realize that my life is not necessarily under my control or plan, I can be more flexible about responding to changes, and that changes don't have to be a bad thing. And so there's a lot in that. There's a lot that people have to grapple with and come to understand. And that's why talking it out with other people is important.
The second phase you mentioned is the emotional regulation phase. Let's talk about it a little bit, Richard. What does that mean?
Well, as I mentioned about in talking about education, that one of the things we learn is that under threat, to us, we have a anxiety response, essentially an alarm that goes off. That's the fast way the brain reacts to threat, because our brain is built to react to threat that's like survival threat. It's like life or death. It's like, we better take action right away to make sure we don't get killed. So there's a fast response of the brain that's built into us like that. And that response overwhelms what is usually a slower brain response, which is more analytical and reflective. In the modern world in which we live now, we're usually responding to threat that requires us to be more analytical and reflective than just protecting ourselves against an attack, a physical attack. Like the pandemic, even though, of course, there's a physical aspect of it, a medical aspect, a lot of it has to do with how it's changed our lives. And we have to be analytical and reflective in figuring out how to deal with that. So we have to comfort ourselves or regulate all the anxiety that comes with that initial threat so that we can think straight and think more slowly and reflectively about what to do. So the emotional regulation part is giving people some strategies to use to keep themselves relatively calm in the midst of all this, so they can think more deliberately about what to do, what to make of all of this.
Right.
So any strategies that relieve stress, relieve anxiety, calm the mind might be useful in helping people advance towards some kind of change that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Are there any strategies that you have observed or seen that works very well?
Well, generally the strategies, we could divide them into either physical activity, because physical activity of some sort utilizes all the anxiety and the stress that comes from the physical reactions in a more healthy way. So engaging in physical activity, it could be running, bicycle riding, swimming, any kind of exercise regimen, anything like that. So physical activity is good because it kind of uses up that anxiety that has to go somewhere. It has to be, if it's not going to be used to defend ourselves against a life and death situation, we got to use it for some, in some other kind of physical way.
Yeah.
So that's
it should be consumed, yes.
Yes. And then the other way is to calm. Usually calming the mind through some kind of meditative activity, meditations, yoga, maybe listening to a certain kind of music, maybe combining the physical activity and the meditative activity with maybe a walk in a very beautiful and natural environment, sort of a meditative walk. So combining the physical activity, some kind of calming activity, that's good for emotional regulation. And then the other part of it has to do with, again, thinking in a way about the situation you're in that doesn't generate a lot of this panic and anxiety, by recognizing that this is something I can do something about, that I have some kind of choice in this matter, something I can do, so that it doesn't feel so dangerous to us. Okay,
Right.
so that's the second phase.
Yeah. The third phase is the disclosure phase. So what does that mean?
Well, I was just talking about that earlier, where we have someone to talk to articulate our experience and to explain ourselves to others, and in doing so, kind of explain ourselves to ourselves. So being open about the things that we're going through is important. One of the reasons is also because when we're open, it's emotional relief. We talk about emotional regulation. I think most of us have felt from some time in our history where we have told people about something that's on our mind or that weighs on us or bothers us, and we find emotional relief and calmness afterwards. So that disclosure is important for that reason, as well as the other things I mentioned earlier about kind of figuring out a new way forward.
Right. And the other one is the narrative development. That seems to be interesting.
Well, yes, because if we are in the midst of events that are difficult and are disruptive to our lives, we're often confronted with the idea that, well, maybe my life isn't going just the way I thought. We have narratives or stories about our own lives that we are constructing. And whether we're aware of it very deliberately or not, we're like writing our own autobiographies. You know, it's how I grew up and how I got to where I am and the things that are important in my life and how they changed me. And then we also have a sense of what our futures are. And then these events can occur that disrupt the future and say, oh, I thought it was going to turn out this way, and maybe it's not. Maybe it's going to go in a different direction. Just like you mentioned earlier with some of the friends you have who might have left their careers and moved in a different direction, you know, started something different and new, something that they never thought they might do. So the change to the life narrative is something that we have to grapple with. And right. If we can do that in a very deliberate way, think it through and figure out what our options are, what the possibilities are for our future, and be more active in making those choices rather than just forced into something, that's going to feel better.
Right.
So the life narrative that's disrupted is also one that is loosened up in a way where we can see other possibilities and we can be more flexible about our own lives and what to do with them. Some people have life plans that seem very rigid and, oh, I have it all planned out. I will do this, I'll do that. And it goes, and then something happens. They get it, maybe they get in an accident, or they get a disease, or they get a divorce, or they get fired from their jobs, you know, and suddenly it's like, oh, I guess I won't be operating like that. This isn't the story. This is a different story. Now, what is this going to be? And that disruption is very, you know, very anxiety arousing, but it also allows people to start to think more broadly about, well, what other things might be possible? What am I going to do with this? And that can be useful. So right. that's the fourth element to this process.
Right. I think this is the hardest one, Richard, because you need to change your whole perspective. You have to revisit all your assumptions. You have to accept that everything is not under your control, and you have to pivot throughout life for different after different events. I think this makes it's the hardest.
It is it's very difficult because, you know, we're dealing with this, literally the story of our lives, right? The story of our lives. And hopefully we all get to the end of our lives at some point without too many regrets, right? We don't want to look back on our lives and say we we messed it up, we made bad choices, I shouldn't have lived life this way. Instead, we want to say, when the going was difficult, I made some good choices, and I designed my life in a way that worked out for me, that I had a role in the design of it. I wasn't just reacting to things. I was thoughtful. I did a good job with the time I had in my life.
Right. Last but not least, the fifth one is the service element. I think this is helping others or serving others in order to feel better. So what does this stand for?
Well, if we are to see ourselves through a difficulty in life in a way that makes it meaningful and like it has some purpose to it, one of the best ways is for it to benefit other people, for us to be a benefit to other people. And what we do with this struggle benefits not only ourselves, but others. So designing some life of service where we take what happened to us and make sure it's not all in vain, but directs us towards something that's meaningful and purposeful, and where other people are better for being around us, is a very helpful way of taking the misery and suffering of these traumatic events and allowing it to be something that is worth living through. So the service part can vary a lot. Some people do things that are very public and impressive, like funding a foundation. Like our Boulder Crest Foundation came out of the work of our founder, Ken Falk, who funded this after being in military service and trying to help veterans who had been injured. Sometimes it's something like that, but sometimes it's much more private and personal. It could simply be maybe how you treat other people close to you in your life and how you interact with them in ways that are kinder to them, more generous with them. And so being of service to others can mean something very, very personal and quite private. It can be something more public and everything in between. So this service component allows us to take what has been suffering and tragedy and say to ourselves, well, I've lost a lot in this, but there was something that came out of it that was worthwhile after all. Right.
At the end, you can also give something to other people as well. So let me recall, after these 5 phases, you may experience a change in personal strength. You can face with new possibilities. You can improve your relations. You can have a better appreciation for life, and you can experience some spiritual growth, or the existential perspective of you can change. So that seems to be a very relevant process and change points at the end. So Richard, we are running out of time, but finally, what is interesting for us is all this pandemic time has put a different role to leaders. Now leaders need to better understand their teams, organizations, or individuals in their organizations, and help them to facilitate this post-traumatic growth. So what's maybe some advice of you to the leaders in order to better cope with this post-traumatic issues?
Well, certainly the leaders will need to have their own house in order individually to get their organizations through what they're going through. So they may be having their own individual growth process as they go through this, which might lead them to looking at their people differently than they had before. Maybe they see more possibilities in their people, or maybe they have better relationships with their people, or see the strength of their people, or all these things. So that may be part of it. But more generally, in terms of the organization and its functioning, or where it goes from here, they may have found themselves forced to change the organization in order to help it survive what it's gone through. Some organizations, for example, in the United States, restaurants have been one of the hardest hit organizations because people were prevented from visiting the restaurants and they had to switch to other kinds of functions. So organizations have to be able to change and see what resources they have, especially among their people, that could allow them to be flexible and move in somewhat of a different direction. So I think when leaders give the message to their people in their organization that there is strength in them, that the way forward can be different, but something that they can manage, that the new story of the organization can be something that's exciting, challenging, but exciting. When the leader shows that they can see the possibilities into a future here that could be creative and innovative, people in the organization start to feel some comfort in this and some optimism about the future. This helps them regulate their emotions because they're not just afraid that it's all going to come tumbling down. Instead, they say, oh, maybe there's a future out here in spite of all that's been crazy that's happened in the past year. Let's get to work and seeing what that future can be, and let's make it happen. So leaders who take that kind of approach rather than defensive and just into survival mode may be doing in the long run a great service to their organizations.
Okay. Richard, thank you very much for your time and for being here today and sharing your experiences with us. Really appreciate that.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed our talk.
Thank you, Richard. Sevgili izleyiciler, değerli konuklar, bugün sevgili Richard Tedeschi'yi ağırladık ve gerçekten de çok önemli bir konu olan, içinden geçtiğimiz dönemin en önemli dinamiklerinden biri olan travma dönemini ve bu travma döneminin sonrasını nasıl pozitife çevirebileceğimizi konuştuk. Kendileri hem araştırmalardan hem de mensup olduğu enstitüdeki uygulamalardan çok güzel örnekler verdi ve 2 tane de çok güzel framework anlattı bize. Umarım sizler için de keyifli ve faydalı bir sohbet olmuştur. Bu akşam bizlerle birlikte olduğunuz için, bizi dinlediğiniz için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Hepinize sağlıklı ve iyi günler diliyoruz efendim. Hoşça kalın.